Welcome to the Tech Ed Podcast, where we visit with leaders who are shaping, innovating, and disrupting technical education. People who are not afraid to think differently, not afraid to try something new, all with the goal of securing the American dream for the next generation of STEM and workforce talent. Well, it's Matt Kirkner, your host for the Tech Ed Podcast, and whether you are hearing us on any of the 45 plus podcast platforms on which we now stream, including, of course, Apple and Spotify, and whether you are listening to us from any of the now 106 countries in which the Tech Ed Podcast is available, welcome to the Tech Ed Podcast. As you know, this is a platform where we discuss all kinds of interesting topics with really, really interesting people, Fortune 500 CEOs, chancellors and presidents of universities and colleges, school district superintendents, and so on, public policymakers, including senators, governors, assistant secretaries of labor, and so on. And today, our guest is Jeannine Kunz, and Jeannine is the Chief Workforce Development Officer for SME. Jeannine, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks, Matt. It's good to be here.
It's good to have you. You're in a relatively new role, Chief Workforce Development Officer for SME. It's a brand new role for you. It's a brand new role for the organization. So tell us a little bit about this. How did this come about? What precipitated the development of the new role? And then how does this role fit into the broader goals of SME?
Sure. So thanks, Matt. Yeah, SME, we're actually celebrating our 90th year as a nonprofit dedicated to, celebrating 90 years, dedicated to the advancement of manufacturing. And our purpose is, that simple, to advance manufacturing, but we see that in two ways. One is for technology advancement, and the other is the people side, right? We believe both have to be done in tandem, and I know you share in that. And so while we've had a lot of strength in the area of workforce, it's primarily been in what we call that category of developing the people, right? Squarely in the category of training, educating, and developing. But as we know, and I know you're familiar with this, the complexities of people development is far more than just the training aspects. And so for us to continue on our mission and deliver on what we think is really needed in the industry, we really needed to kind of step up and do more in that space. So it was really a recognition of, where we've been and our strengths, but where we really want to go going forward.
Sounds like a fascinating role. So tell us a little bit more about the role specifically, Chief Workforce Development Officer. What's going to keep you busy, Jeannine, in that role?
This whole ecosystem is so integrated in terms of how our workforce agencies, workforce organizations, other nonprofits, educators, right? There's not a simple map that people can understand. And I think all of us that are in this space know that. But as you go to work with employers and you go from their eyes and they go outside their four walls, it looks a little scary and it's a little complex and it's not easy to follow. So part of that is we sit in a unique position at SME, being that we work nationally, but we also work locally. We work with educators, we work with government, we work with employers. So we can kind of help, coalesce that in a way that's meaningful and impactful and insightful for the particular needs of the industry base, as well as really look at how there's great pockets of excellence, Matt, as you've seen on your podcast and all your years of experience. There's these unique pockets of excellence, as I said, but they're maybe at a local level that they, as an organization, don't have the responsibility or bandwidth to take nationally, and SME can do those kinds of things. So it's kind of trying to help the employers a little bit more beyond just developing their workforce, but building that pipeline, retaining their current workforce, but also helping other organizations that are in this workforce space and do really good things. How can SME partner more and accelerate so that everybody wins in a way?
It really sounds like partnering and linking things together, where it's originally where you started with this whole link between technology and people. We talk about the link between the things going on at a national level, maybe a state or a local level. The other link that you mentioned, Jeannine, that I know is really, really important to you and to SME is the link between academia and industry. And as I look at your board of directors, as I look at those who are influencing the organization, really an intentional approach to make sure that you're represented both by industrial employers and people doing innovative things in industry and academia. So talk to us a little bit about that. How does that, the different perspectives that you're getting from both industry and from the world of education affect your strategic planning, and especially as that relates to workforce development?
Yeah, it's a tremendous asset that we have. I think, and all nonprofits have their board of directors, and I've been lucky enough for 20 years to work with our board of directors, which are some of the most brilliant people in manufacturing, innovative, entrepreneurial, whether that's in the classroom, in government, or in industry. And as you said, we really try to have a pretty mix. It's actually purposeful, as you said, to represent. We talk about this topic of workforce. Well, employers of all sizes can cite the same challenge, maybe finding people, right? How that manifests in a small business is dramatically different than a large business. So having those insights on our board and not just having one perspective allows us to not only understand the challenge, but also start to design solutions that are meaningful for those various perspectives. The same is true in having representation from a community college perspective or for your institution, different audiences, different landscapes. So that all plays together, and then it comes together between industry and academia, as you said, is then how do we, as an entire ecosystem, start to think about leveraging SME's national platform and voice and solutions to impact the industry.
And it's so interesting that you put it that way. In fact, one of my first, I'd heard about SME for a long time, and then interacted with a couple of members of your team at the executive level. It's about 2 or 3 years ago. We were at a meeting in Milwaukee, actually sharing best practices in education and in industry, and it was just obvious right out of the blocks that the individuals from SME had a really unique perspective into that discussion. Really interesting to meet them. So to make a couple connections, coincidentally, that meeting took place at Rockwell Automation here in Milwaukee. Blake Moret, of course, the chairman and CEO of Rockwell, a former guest here on the Tech Ed podcast and a good friend of ours. But I met a number of SME folks at that. Continuing on the Rockwell thread, we were actually at Automation Fair earlier this year, and we were live podcasting from and live streaming on YouTube from Automation Fair, which is, I think a lot of people know, Rockwell Automation's big trade show or big event that they do every year. And so one of our guests on that podcast was a gentleman, I'm sure, whose name rings a bell with you, which was John Dyke. And John is the CEO of SESME, one of the manufacturing institutes. And I want to talk a little bit more, first of all, about how it's just amazing how all this converges, right? So you're on with us today. You have a partnership with SESME we're about to talk about. I met SME people at Rockwell. It really is an ecosystem, as you put it, in this world of technical education and advancing STEM education, advancing workforce, advancing engineering, and so on. So there's so many of us that are pulling in the same direction. But I want to get into this partnership that you have with SESME, and you put together this 2022 Smart Manufacturing Market Survey, which I think is just going to be really fascinating for us to get into, because as we talk to, especially small to mid-sized employers, they're all over the map in terms of where they are in their digital journey, their Industry 4.0 journey, and so on. So let's just start out by, when we think about this journey, or I'm sorry, this survey, Jeannine, what was the impetus for the survey, and what were the goals?
Yeah, and so one quick example, I think, if I could interject this, because I think, like you said, that all those interconnections, this end up culminating in, I think, a really good example how SESME and SME, when we met, right, a couple of years ago, knew of each other, right, but sat down and really said, you're trying to accelerate the adoption of SMART. You're trying to accelerate the learning and the skills around SMART. SME, you're trying to do that, but we both have different strengths, right? We both came to the table with different expertise, knowledge, access, et cetera. And it was really that spirit, as you said, because it's a very interconnected space. And the more we can kind of come together to do those things and put the employer, the student, the educator, the individual at the center of our thinking. So design thinking, just like we would do in manufacturing, we do the same thing about solutions for workforce, et cetera. So that was really the impetus of our relationship, and it had multiple aspects to it. But one of them was a survey. So one was to say we have our thoughts and we have our opinions, but let's really kind of go out and start to understand our goal being the democratization of SMART, and certainly including that in workforce. What are our inhibitors? And that was really kind of the rationale that I'm happy to share about too.
Tell us about who you surveyed and who participated and how they were able to participate.
Yeah, we did. And this was an online survey. So it was of employers. We went out to, thousands of employers, got, several hundred back. So, a statistical sample size. in terms of soliciting feedback. But this was really meant to be a quantitative survey of employers of various sizes, but we did have a heavy emphasis on small business.
Got it. So as we get into some of the findings, what I love thinking about is what are the things that surprised you, or what are some of the unexpected pieces of feedback that you received from the folks that participated that, I think in my mind, help influence policy, help influence strategy, because it's one thing to do something that and act on information that everybody knows. But what are some of those things that shocked you a little bit?
Yeah. So one was, and like you said, it's shocked, but in one sense, you kind of scratch your head or you kind of go, I guess it maybe wasn't totally shocking. But when we asked what their greatest inhibitor was, right. And it was focused more on technology, right. It was like, what's stopping you from adopting and digitizing and connecting your operations? Is it cybersecurity? Is it that feeling, right? Is it just understanding the technologies and the platforms? And the number one thing was cited as 59%, I believe was the close to 60% said talent. And so that was number one. And so number two was cost and complexity of the technology. And number three was lack of connection between, I think, the impact of doing it to business outcomes, right? So call it a little bit of a mix of people, technology and systems, and then business outcomes. Those were the top, but talent was number one.
And I'm not surprised necessarily the talent was number one, but that it's 59% of the folks that participated in this say that that's a significant inhibitor or a significant concern. And, it feels to me a little bit like we're turning the corner on this whole idea of, it's got so many different names now, digital transformation, smart technology, industry 4.0, IIoT, and like you, I spent a lot of time talking with folks about these different advancements that are taking place in technology. 5 years ago, nobody had even heard of, you brought up Industry 4.0 and it was all blank stares. And then, even after they started to grasp the idea of smart technology, smart sensors, data analytics, predictive analytics, all these applications and business use cases for the technology in the world of manufacturing, it was still like, where do we go with this? And it feels like, thanks to folks like you and SME and others, that we're starting to turn the corner on that. And people are at least starting to recognize that, first of all, they have to be on the bandwagon in some form or another. 3 or 4 years ago, especially small to mid-sized businesses, we'll get into that in a minute, would just be like, well, this isn't going to affect us. Like I said, it feels to me like folks are at least now waking up and recognizing that they have to have an approach. As a result of this information that you gathered, Jeannine, were you able to set some achievable goals or some achievable objectives rather for the small to mid-sized businesses?
We formed an acceleration framework with SESME. And a lot of that started with, because again, you have then those employers, even in the survey, you would say, okay, well, I want to, I just don't know what to do, which is what you're kind of getting at, or I'm stuck. And so the framework we put together was to try to help those small businesses and look at what would you do first. And certainly it may sound silly to say this, but based on our experience, we do know that this first step that I'm going to say is not always as simple and obvious, which is just to become aware of what is it, right? Because you said that these terms get used pretty frequently in a lot of different contexts. They have a lot of different meanings in different spaces, but just become aware of what is AI, what is machine learning, and how then are those maybe applications being used. So just that awareness piece, we certainly really play up, because sometimes people jump right to, I bought technology and I'm trying to adopt it. So, and then you're reverse engineering the process. So that was the first one. The second one was like, now that you're aware and you're starting to kind of dream and think through what that might look like, is do an assessment. And that assessment isn't just a technology assessment of your existing infrastructure. It's not just your systems, it's your culture. It is your people and your workforce, the training, systems, all that kind of aspect of assessing the business, to then to start to help to understand kind of a little bit of a scorecard of where you're at. And then, then obvious parts start to get into more pick up a project, an isolated, thing to kind of pilot, try the whole plan, do, check, adjust kind of model. While it may sound really kind of basic, sometimes just breaking it down into steps like that is helpful. And I guess the last thing I'll say to that is SESME and SME and other organizations are doing this, is also, especially to small to mid-sized manufacturers, trying to make sure that there's people there to walk with them if they need that. So while the tools were put together, we also know sometimes tools need a little bit of service and handholding. And organizations, whether those are colleges or the MEP system, the Manufacturing Extension Partnership, SESME and SME is also trying to work with those organizations to help on the local level.
It really is as simple as some of this basic blocking and tackling that we do in business, that we do in manufacturing, but looking at it from a different way and understanding the digital thread and how smart technology can augment that. One of the things that when we're advising, especially small and mid-sized businesses on their digital journey or their Industry 4.0 journey, I just always say, let's start out with where are you handling continuous improvement? What is your what is your approach to lean? What is your approach to Kaizen? How are you determining, how you're going to improve your organization, removing barriers, improving process? I just go back to the theory of constraints, which is Goldrat's book, which is now 30 some years old, probably, but it's still kind of the Bible of lean manufacturing and of the theory of constraints. And how are we then bringing new technology to solve problems? It's not a step transformation. It is just a question of how are you doing continuous improvement? And it's another continuous improvement tool in the same sense that something like Poka-Yoke or 5S or Six Sigma or any of these other tools we use in lean manufacturing would come to bear. So I like the way you answer that. Let's become aware of what the technology is, and let's understand where we're starting from. Everybody's starting somewhere, and I think most small to mid-sized manufacturers are surprised when they find out that as far behind as they think they are, they're really not any further behind than anybody else. Everybody's just trying to figure that out, and then how do we find that kind of manageable project or that manageable continuous improvement opportunity for us to put this to work on. So speaking of continuous improvement, I know that you're continually improving your leadership team. This is another example in partnership with SESME. Just launching the Smart Manufacturing Executive Council, which I was fascinated by. In fact, John Dyke brought it up when we were talking with him just a few short weeks ago. And it's been described as a national think tank of smart manufacturing leaders. So talk to us a little bit about who's serving on the council, and we'll dive in a little bit deeper into what you're doing.
Yeah, no, we're really excited. And, if I looked at, I've been in this for a little over 20 years, I can't think of a time I've been probably more encouraged to see when you think about, there's about 18 to 20 employers of, these are some of the largest employers, right? So you get you get diversity, General Mills to an automotive, a GM or a Ford, to a Raytheon, to a Caterpillar, right? Pretty good Johnson & Johnson, good diversity, but obviously big iconic brands in manufacturing. But in the end, they're the front line, right? Back like when you talked about this lean and the journey, they're the ones that are with no real roadmap, right? They're on the front line. So they're kind of bearing the brunt of learning, and retooling and sharing that. But they're also realizing the importance of taking a leadership position. So the fact that they're coming together and the executive roles that they're in to give their time and treasure and talent to the entire ecosystem is, I think, a testament to, one, the challenge, and two, the fortitude of our industry, really. So we've brought them together, SESME and SME, and John and I are leading with that group to really address things like the entire ecosystem, to address the technology, right, challenges. And that includes, right, from the vendors and the systems and the software side, as well as the workforce. So we're really excited about working with that group of talent and individuals to kind of help carry forward as nonprofits then, so they can go back to their day jobs and help go move the industry forward.
So as we look at this year of 2023, hard to believe time is moving as fast as it is. What are some of the big things that you expect the Smart Manufacturing Executive Council to be putting their heads together and working on this year?
We're also recognizing the importance of integrating in 2023 the voices of the small businesses, the educators, right? So that just didn't want to lose sight, and the technology providers. So it'll certainly be part of what we start to fold in 2023.
Sure.
But another pretty big initiative that we're lining up is something I was appointed to the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine through Congress. DOE is the sponsor, Department of Energy. And our charter, our appointment is to do a national plan around smart manufacturing. Why I bring that up is, if you think about that, which is a coalition of individuals, university, industry, nonprofits, and I'm representing SME on that, but you've got this think tank of people, right? So I'm on the call and we're trying to figure out how do we get the information and insights for this national plan that ultimately goes to Congress. And you have these employers who are saying, I want to impart my knowledge. I want to share this, and then, seek how that affects legislation, policy, infrastructure, right, and workforce and things. So John and I are working right to engage them in that avenue and that workshop to bring their voice through that. So that would be one aspect of it. And then certainly starting to address those other components, which is the ecosystem, technology, and workforce.
And it sounds like you and the Smart Manufacturing Executive Council will be right in the middle of influencing where those organizations are going vis-a-vis smart energy and smart manufacturing, and making sure that we're taking best practices across every sector of our economy. So many times people lose sight of the fact that, this whole world of Industry 4.0 or smart manufacturing, it overlaps like crazy in every other sector of the economy. So really great work, and kudos to the SME for your leadership on that council. If we were to look over we talked about next year and some of the things that the Smart Manufacturing Executive Council will be involved in. What if we turn the clock forward 5 years, Jeannine? What would you see the impact of the work of that group?
So in 5 years, we're really seeking to start to have very clear expectations, demand signals, if you will, of what are those skills that are needed. Certainly starting to break down the inhibitors that we feel like that I mentioned earlier, the complexity of the infrastructure. It's something we're really, from a technology standpoint, really wanted to integrate and work with the technology providers that I know is at the forefront of our thinking. And then certainly trying to influence what's happening, as you said, from a policy legislative standpoint, but also I think some of the things that SME and SESME can do, certainly beyond what the council, but the spirit of the entire initiative is to connect, like what you said, because there's the Department of Defense. We've talked a lot about these interconnections. I was at the Defense Manufacturing Conference last week, and you've got, Office of Secretary of Defense and lots of communication about smart. And so even though SESME is a Department of Energy, and the national plan I mentioned was a Department of Energy sponsored, there's still a strong connection to the Department of Defense. So, and many others that you mentioned. So really, in those 5 years is trying to make sure we're linking up to and syncing, because we don't have time, right? Nobody has time to be reinventing the wheel. So a lot of this hub and spoke of trying to pay attention. And it really went back to this very front end of our conversation about this labyrinth of things that are going on. And so it just takes a lot of time to make sure those pieces are cohesively put together in a way that's impactful.
It's a little reminiscent of a program I worked on earlier this year with a college here in the Midwest. And one of the observations that we made that I think is being echoed by what you just said there, Jeannine, is if you think about just about any sector of our economy, whether it's defense, whether it's energy, and you can add to that retail, hospitality, agriculture, smart government, manufacturing, certainly, and so on, you kind of see the same continuum of smart technology. In other words, in manufacturing, we have smart sensors and smart devices. Those communicate with programmable logic controllers and computer networks. And in turn, we have data collectors that collect data from those platforms. We typically have an enterprise level software that is managing the entire enterprise for, in this case, a manufacturing company, and then feeding all that information up to the cloud where we're using platforms, including artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms and software to predict the future and kind of figure out where things are going. That continuum repeats itself across every sector of the economy. And so a lot of times when we focus on smart technology, it almost doesn't matter the sector. If we understand that continuum, we can take that and apply it somewhere else. So really, really important work that I think you're doing. We actually built a degree program in that case around the idea of having an IIoT technician that, regardless of the sector, they could bring that understanding of smart technology. It sounds like in some ways you're taking exactly the same approach along with SESME. One of the most interesting things that we just talked about, going back to the conversation we had about the incumbent workforce or about talent, 59% of your respondents to your survey saying that talent is their key issue here as we head into this Industry 4.0 revolution, or whatever we want to call it. And I'll be honest with you, 5-6 years ago, I felt a little bit like I was beating my head against the wall when I was talking to especially small to mid-sized manufacturing companies about the importance of incumbent worker training. We spent so much time talking about getting young people excited about careers in smart manufacturing and boosting up our community and technical college programs and our 4-year engineering programs around this technology so that we have the talent coming into manufacturing that we need. But that's really only half the puzzle, and probably less than half the puzzle as we look to the future. The other challenge we have is, what are we going to do with all these people that already work in manufacturing, who are working in a market that is changing like crazy, but maybe aren't sharpening their skills around what the future of work is going to look like? Are you seeing that same, first of all, problem? And then are we turning the corner? Are people starting to wake up to how important this is going to be?
Yeah, so definitely seeing the same problem. I think you articulate it well. And even as you say it, right, you just kind of get this heavyweight feeling. Right. I felt like I got smaller in my chair the more you talked, right? Because it's not for the faint of heart. And it's really kind of like you said, 5, 10 years ago when I would find myself, I felt like I was a little bit like on a soapbox, like, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you doing
Right.
this? But then the more you really even listen to what you just said and you think about all that's coming at our manufacturers, especially small to mid-sized manufacturers, you really can empathize, right? When that's just the people side. And in the end of the day, people are changing in front of us, right? When we think about what's been happening in our world, work and workers is no longer the same thing as it was even just 3 years ago. So we had these challenges coming in and the pandemic hit and all kinds of new things entered our space of how individuals approach their work, their social contract with their employer, what their expectations are. And it's like, and you can appreciate this with your technical background. It's like we talk about Six Sigma and variability in manufacturing. It's like, think about the variability with people,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And so you're trying to kind of engineer something or systemize it, and it's like it's a moving target. So I would say yes, totally see the same challenges. Unfortunately, the challenges are growing because of the things I've mentioned. However, the second part, I think you said, are we seeing kind of a wake up to it? Most certainly. At least I think the nice thing we've got for us is, for us at SME and my role, is a little bit of that trend of time to see, is it better or worse in terms of proactively doing something? And the answer is yes. We are seeing improvement in addressing what's going on inside their four walls. But also, one of the things I've really like seen the last couple of years is people stepping out of their four walls and really recognizing the importance of getting in their community, getting with their schools, and thinking about their future worker, not just the current workers.
Yeah, I never thought of a psychologist as a Six Sigma black belt for people, but your answer there just kind of said the same thing. You think about this changing world of work, and you think about how much individuals' worlds have changed in the last 3 or 4 years in so many ways, and we could spend an entire podcast just talking about how 2023 is different from 2019, but different in so many incredible ways, and in other ways, starting to get back to the basics. We talk repeatedly on this podcast about the way we used to train the manufacturing workforce. And if you look back at the 1970s, the average manufacturing employee received 100 hours a year of skills-based training at work provided by their employer. And when we tell employers that, they're dumbfounded. And I can tell you, in my 23 years as a manufacturing CEO, we had learning companies and we were committed to lifelong learning, but nothing on order of 100 hours a year. But that's really what built our manufacturing workforce as we moved through Industry 3.0. A lot of that was being driven by the unions that were requiring companies as part of their union contracts to train their employees. But we really got away from that to where we're now. The average manufacturing employee gets about 5 hours a year of ongoing training. And it's mainly just the OSHA stuff that they're required to train so that they can remain compliant. And I'm seeing the same thing. We're starting to see employers turn the corner, understanding that the vast majority of my workforce 20 years from now are people that are already working in my organization today. And how am I going to upskill that? As you talk to employers around upskilling toward Industry 4.0, advanced manufacturing, smart technology, Jeannine, what are some of the obstacles that they raise in terms of the challenges with upskilling their incumbent workforce?
Yeah, and so I think you said all that really well too, and it's unfortunate to see kind of the lack of time sometimes that's put towards it, and that's actually the inhibitor we always hear. It's like we don't have time, right? Don't have time, and it feels a little bit of a tornado or a hamster wheel because they can't get the people, right? Then they're not getting enough time. So people are having to run longer shifts, or they're just not able to kind of have the excess capacity. However, that's not also a good strategy, right? And so even though they know it, it kind of gets caught up in that bad cycle. So we certainly hear we don't have the time. We hear, I don't even know how to go about doing this, right? What do I do, right? I know I need to do something, but what are those steps back to kind of a process? Unfortunately, sometimes we do hear people say we might lose them to somebody else, right? We might lose them to the bigger company. And I always say, well, is it a good strategy to keep them then, right? Like, is our goal is to keep them unqualified as you advance your organization? Because I don't know if that's going to work either, right? So sometimes you just have to jump in and really get that commitment with back to that social contract with your employees and address cultural issues. So, I would say, interestingly, what we're also hearing now is, we actually had an employer the other day say this to me: forget talking to me about training. I don't even have people to train. Like, they're almost like, I just need the people,
Right.
which kind of goes back to your first question of us, which is, we couldn't just squarely just keep sitting in the category of helping them develop their people. We actually have to go spend more time at SME building that pipeline and attracting and doubling down our efforts as a nonprofit to do that.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's an and, not an or. They have to do both of those, in my opinion. Yes, you have to have pathways to and pipelines to and from your K-12 districts, to and from your technical and community colleges. You have to be sitting on their advisory boards. You have to be meeting with the students. You have to open up your plant or your facility so that people recognize how amazing advanced manufacturing is and what an incredibly rewarding career it can be. And we have to figure out what to do with all these people in our organizations that need upskilling as manufacturing technology changes. So, like so many things, it's an and, not an or. Your discussion about the concern that people have of upskilling and losing their people always resonates with me. I had a conversation. It's somebody who's a really good friend of mine, so I could get away with saying this, but he runs a huge machining company. And this goes back about 4 or 5 years. And I was really encouraging him to think about how he could upskill his incumbent workforce. And he said, I just, I worry about, they've got like these certifications, but I worry that if I give my people these certifications, they're just going to be more marketable to another company. And I looked him in the eye, I said, it's a way better strategy just to keep your people stupid for their whole career so they never leave. And he burst out laughing. I mean, he recognized what a folly that was to look at training that way. And today he's got a fairly robust incumbent worker training program, thanks to that conversation. So I think you and I totally agree on that. That was an interesting, firsthand view into the way that an industrial employer was thinking about training at that time, and now certainly doing it much better. Do you have an example of a company you think is doing this well that our listeners could model as they're thinking about the future of their training programs?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was hearing you say that, and I just have to say, it reminds me of like, I never thought of it till you just said it, but I thought, well, could you imagine fielding a football team and saying you're not going to have a practice or train and invest in them because they might get taken away? It's like,
yeah, I'm gonna give you credit for that the first 2 times I use it, and then I'm gonna flat out steal it.
All right, then you're gonna steal it.
That's beautiful.
But to your question about good examples. Thank goodness we have lots. We actually created a I think it's called Manufacturing Training Excellence Award. And it was really established, Matt, for the purpose of almost exemplifying people who are doing it well, to share best practices, and then to celebrate those, to say, you're doing the right things, do more of that, and hopefully you'll get your story out to others. And our last award, a couple of years ago, Boeing, so big company, probably no surprise, they're following a lot of the really good, what we call high impact learning organizations, best practices. But this past year was a smaller company, but it's still several hundred people, but an automotive safety glass company in Ohio. And they were doing a very holistic look where they really felt and they saw the importance of their people as a number one asset, as their competitive differentiator tied to business results, right? So they really took and bestowed that. From what I would say, one of the key things is it's not just about training your people, but showing from a top down that it's not just about skills, it's showing an investment to our earlier conversation, that you care and you believe that they are an important part of your organizational win, right? And success, I should say. So that company, right, did a lot of different things, right? Certainly using blended learning, career progression models, right? So people understood how they get from one spot to another. A lot of stuff around standardization to ensure, right, that things were clear, validated, that someone understood. But that improved their culture, their retention, right? So sometimes we don't think about those as KPIs that translate to dollars, but they do.
They 100%
and so,
do.
yeah, so that's that company is AGC Automotive North America, is out of Ohio, is the company.
That's fantastic, and a great firsthand example, Jeannine, of somebody who's doing this really, really well. And it's so important as we look to the future of training and look to the future of creating this next generation workforce for employers to be making investments like that. And I think you're right. I came from manufacturing. For me, everything was ROI. So we're going to buy a new punch press. We're going to put in a new powder coating line. Okay, how much am I going to reduce my costs? What's going to happen to yield? What am I going to do with my workforce? Am I going to, where are my costs going to come from? And can I pay that back? Sometimes people are surprised, but our target payback was always 6 months or less. If we could make a CapEx investment and pay that back in 6 months or less, that was a good investment. It doesn't mean that we didn't do things that took a little bit longer, but we would focus on those ones with really, really quick paybacks. And then we get into this world of training, and it's like, well, it's not so easy to say I've got 4 people working here and now I'm going to have 2, and I'm using $1 million worth of raw powder, and now I'm going to use $800,000 a year. It doesn't work that way. It's a lot softer, but you think about all the benefits that come from incumbent worker training. And you mentioned, I think, the key ones. And, part of it is that employee retention, building up this culture. The other thing I tell people is, as hard as it is to find a new employee in an unskilled position, it's that much harder to find a new employee in a skilled position. And if I can take my people that are already working in my organization and upskill them into positions of greater responsibility and higher skill, number one, I'm going to pay that person more money. Number two, I'm going to create an environment and a reputation for a company that develops its people. So I'll become a destination employer or an employer of choice. And number three, I'm opening up a position that's a lot easier to fill by promoting somebody that's already been working in my organization as in a less skilled position into a more skilled position. So there's all of these benefits that come. And then you've got somebody that maybe has a better understanding of manufacturing. Maybe they're catching a problem sooner, so that's improving throughput. Maybe they're fixing a problem faster, so that's improving uptime. There's all of these benefits that come from training. And I think once people really think about that, the investment, it's not even just a good investment, it's an imperative investment. And I'm just a believer in the same way that things like standardized quality 20 years ago totally revolutionized manufacturing. Kaizen and continuous improvement 10 and 15 years ago totally revolutionized manufacturing here in the United States. As we look forward, it's going to be smart technology and investing in the incumbent workforce that are going to be really, really important. I think a key element of that in a lot of cases that folks are starting to understand in industry and in education, and this is new. I didn't know what a third-party certification was at all when I was in manufacturing. Then I get over to the world of education. I think somebody had done a survey right about the time that I made that switch back in 2015. They said there were like 950 third-party certifications or workforce certifications that existed in education. I was a manufacturing CEO running fairly large manufacturing companies, had no idea any of this was even there. And then we get over here and there's all these certifications. What I've since learned is there are some that do it really, really well. And then some that have certifications that are maybe more around trying to sell XYZ, or I needed this for funding, which may or may not be the right incentive or the right strategy. But in your mind, I know you spend a lot of time around this world of third-party certifications for smart technology, advanced manufacturing. What makes a great certification, Jeannine?
Yeah, and thanks. Yeah, SME is fortunate to be a certifying body since the 1970s, following, like you said, those kind of standard. But it is a world that's very confusing, I should say. The word certificate, certification. So a lot of people use them, kind of like we talked about, smart, interchangeable words.
Right.
And but there are actual kind of stipulations that make something a standard certification, like you would think of a professional certification. And some of those criteria, even having a governing body, that if someone's looking to figure out, is that an actual certification or is it a certificate program to the Jeannine Kunz School of, Metrology, there's a difference, right? That doesn't mean it's bad. It's just to know the differences, and there's a time and a place for both. But so having a governing body that oversees it, like so SME certifications and others like ours, like an AWS, the welding, MSSC with production technician, certification, those that you'd be familiar with, those would have kind of these oversight committees that are responsible from industry. They run psychometrics on there to ensure, no biases. They're industry driven. They're re-looked at from the bodies of knowledge, right? There's a number of criteria that actually is, we actually even have a white paper on it from some work I do on a coalition for career development as a different nonprofit we stood up. That Brian Albrecht, you would know Brian. Yeah. So
of course.
Yeah.
I was with Brian yesterday, as a matter
Well, there you go. So he's certainly on there, and some of our good friends, Leo Reddy, people you would know. So good examples of organizations that are following those practices, right? And so those are some of them, I think, Matt, you were asking about, because we do get that question, and some of us came together under that Coalition for Career Development. The Manufacturing Institute was involved, right? So we kind of created what we called like a quality assurance committee and National Governors Association was involved, and we did a paper, if you will, and that's on the Coalition for Career Development's website that people can download to give them guidance when they're looking at grants or funding or colleges or companies to know the difference.
Absolutely. Well, I'll tell you, I want to be first in line for the Jeannine Kunz certification in metrology. That sounds fascinating.
We'd be all in trouble. We'd be in big trouble.
Sign me up for that one. One of the things that I learned through some of our work with certification bodies, and you mentioned several of them, there's actually an ISO standard, ISO 17024 for certification. So there's a set of rules by which organizations can set their certifications up to make sure that they're doing the kinds of things that you're thinking about, which is making sure that questions are unbiased, making sure that we're actually representing and assessing industry relevant skills and so on, all kinds of ways to monitor that. I even talked with, interestingly enough, a certification body a couple of weeks ago that's using artificial intelligence and machine learning to ensure that there's no bias in the questions that they're asking. It those questions are actually driving toward the competency that they're trying to measure. So a really interesting application of technology that we wouldn't have even talked about 5-10 years ago. Probably in the whole world of technology, wouldn't have been talking much 10 years ago about virtual reality as well, in artificial intelligence or augmented reality, rather, some of these technologies that are really revolutionizing the way that we learn. So you get to see a lot of this, right? You go to a lot of conferences, you talk to a lot of people that are doing cutting edge things. Obviously, SME is right in the middle of how we use technology to train and upskill individuals. What are some of those trends that you're seeing from a technology application standpoint in technical education that our audience would be interested in learning more about?
Yeah, you touched on one. I might remember that. I didn't even, to be honest, I didn't think about the AI for our certification program, but that's actually really good. So thank you for that takeaway.
Sure.
And I'm impressed by your ISO knowledge. So you are, you're a ringer. You know a lot.
We're here to share best practices. So I guarantee you, I'm learning more from you than you're learning from me. But we're happy to have the conversation, and the goal is that the audience learns something from both of us.
Yeah, and so regarding the technology, as I mentioned, we're pretty big advocates, as you can imagine, for technology, certainly in the manufacturing environment, like we talked for today, but also in the learning environment. And so some of the things we're seeing and some of the things we're implementing even ourselves. But you mentioned AR, even that company I mentioned that won our Training Excellence Award. They were using augmented reality to look at, instructions on site, for standardization of work, AI tools being used in recruiting. So some aspects of that workforce development, certainly lots of applications you can use in AI from even a learning perspective. But then virtual reality is one that we're really close to. We just launched recently our virtual reality labs. And a lot of it had to do with this expansion of where we had some strength and call it the knowledge, where people could learn things. But as we know, that's only part of it, right? We certainly don't try to pretend that you can learn welding just by taking e-learning or something or sitting in the classroom. You've got to go practice and perform. So we have a methodology called Learn, Practice, Perform. That learning you could get done, whether it's sitting in a classroom, whether it's taking e-learning, whether it's whatever that, learning, but go practice. And so that idea of using virtual reality, we've launched it. And what's really interesting, we're getting a lot of really great feedback on it certainly allows things to be safe in a classroom if someone doesn't know what they're doing, right? Speaking of welding, or they don't have access to the equipment. This is maybe another way to do it. It helps boost retention. So there's a lot of benefits from adopting technology. But one thing I guess I'd close on here is, as much as we're a technology rich industry, and manufacturing is built on technology, right? We love our technology. And yet we're probably on a scale of comparing ourselves to other sectors and using it in learning, we're behind, right? So we're behind other sectors that are much faster to adopt technology in the learning, training, education environment than we are in manufacturing. That's got to change.
Yeah, I agreed. And especially in the small and mid-sized business world where, and I've run small and mid-sized manufacturing companies, your day job is getting production out the door, keeping customers happy, producing a quality product. And, it's the important, not urgent. So much of this, as Stephen Covey would have put it, is important, not urgent. It's important to train our people. It's not always urgent. It's important to adopt new technology. It's not always urgent. And so it's so important for manufacturers to discipline themselves around not just what you need to get done by the end of the day today, but where's your organization going to be in 2 or 3 years? And so many great applications to use technology, not just in the manufacturing process, but also in the learning process. You talk about virtual reality, and I mean, I love that technology, and I love the way that you put it. We're not going to teach a welder how to weld using virtual reality, but if we get the theory done using an e-learning platform or maybe in a one-to-many lecture, and then we can use technologies like virtual reality to accelerate the learning and allow them to make faster mistakes that have less serious consequences. And the other thing we find is that individuals that may be intimidated by that technology and getting into a weld booth, and I ran a fairly significant fabrication operation for a number of years, it's a little bit intimidating to put that helmet on and to pull the curtain back and, get in there and start welding. But if we can do that using virtual reality, get people comfortable around that technology, we can really accelerate the learning process. And so I know you're all about accelerating learning. I know that another part of that mission to accelerate learning is the Education Foundation that you're intimately involved in with SME. So talk to us about how the SME Education Foundation is partnering with schools all over the United States to drive some of these technologies and this learning forward.
Yeah, one, I'll just get a shout out for anyone who has young family members or students in their classroom. We give out about $1 million of scholarships to support kids going into 2-year and 4-year schools. So by all means, that's one thing we do, and it's an important part, and we've been doing that for decades. And, like a Rockwell sits on our foundation. You mentioned Rockwell earlier, but we did create a program which is called PRIME, Partnership Response and Manufacturing Education. And that was really to kind of really roll up our sleeves, get into the communities, seek corporate funders. So we talked about companies coming outside of their 4 walls, investing in the pipeline. And that is their supplier. It's a supplier of people. And I think we would all be arguing here, right? It's just the number one asset, right? For a company, number one's part of the supply chain. So what we did is we designed a program, Partnership Response and Manufacturing Education, which is about getting the employers, the educators together at the table, defining where we go do a market analysis of the jobs, the skills in that market. And then the funding that we receive either through, sometimes we've had the chambers, economic development, corporations. Most recently, we're doing more with state government. So example, state of Michigan, governor gave us $6 million to invest in 17 new prime schools.
Great. And Governor Whitmer, we'll give her credit, right?
Yes, Governor Whitmer gets credit there. And we have a number of other states that are kind of in conversations with us, because the one-to-one on employers was slower to move, right? Mm-hmm. And I think everyone sees the need to do this. And the model is, I think, a good one. There's many good models. It's not the only one. But what we do then is we're able to really equip them with the state of the art, right? So a FANUC robot, or, the right and more industrial equipment gets put in.
Right.
And you're familiar with that world, right? So it's equipping them.
For sure. Yep. Absolutely. I've actually partnered with Prime in another part of my life. You do great work. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So it's equipping them with that, with curriculum, aligning things, getting the certification programs in there, like an MSSC, teacher training, marketing, career counseling. So really a holistic view. And we're really proud to say that, we have 89% of kids that graduate from prime schools across our whole network. Last year, we don't have this year's statistic yet, continue to pursue manufacturing, whether that was direct to employment, go to a 2-year school or a 4-year school. And while we know it wasn't all because of us, we hope to think that we played a part in equipping them.
Say that number again, 89%.
89%. Yeah.
That's incredible. Yeah. I mean, that is a lot of organizations and a lot of programs would be happy with, 40 to 50% choosing those careers. And you're at 89. That's amazing.
Yeah, we're really excited about that. Yeah. Thank you.
Absolutely. And so for our audience members who are excited about it, I know they'll want to learn more about SME. Before I ask you our final question, Jeannine, for those that want to learn more about the organization, where do they find you?
SME.org.
Easy enough. Yeah, that's a beautiful answer. And then my final question for Jeannine Kunz this afternoon is this one. And that is, if you were to look back to being 16 years old and thinking about having your whole life ahead of you, and as much as so many of our listeners are young people who are thinking about their future careers, if there was one piece of advice that you could give your younger self, Jeannine, what would that be?
I would say, don't assume that there's constraints. I think especially for young people, we tend to create constraints in our own mind before I sometimes give myself this, and I give some of my employees, like, why did you assume that that's there? Just let someone tell you no, let someone stop you, right? Don't create the constraint. Don't assume that there's a constraint. Just move forward and follow what you believe in.
I love it. Don't assume there's a constraint. Don't put that box around yourself. There's so many things that you're capable of and so many opportunities in front of you. I appreciate the unconstrained way in which you answered our questions today, Jeannine. It was wonderful to have you on. Jeannine Kunz with SME. She is the Chief Workforce Development Officer, was with us today here on the Tech Ed Podcast. Jeannine, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you, Matt. Really appreciate it. Take care.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Tech Ed Podcast. If you haven't already, subscribe, leave a review, and if you liked this episode, share it with a friend. New episodes launch every Tuesday, so listen in next week.